The United States will monetize the debt, and here's why. A debt overview. Today, the U.S. government debt is over $13 trillion. Unfunded liabilities account for over $100 trillion more, but we'll ignore this and focus only on the $13 trillion currently owed. How big is 13 trillion? To count to 13 trillion at a rate of one number per second would take more than 400,000 years. $13 trillion is enough to give $1,900 to every man, woman, and child on the planet. What are the options? When faced with a debt, a government has two options. The first is to simply default on the debt or not pay it. The second is to pay it off, which can be done a few different ways. You can reduce expenditures, you can increase government receipts, or you can monetize the debt. Now, what does it mean to monetize the debt? Monetizing the debt simply means to print up new money in order to pay off the owed sum. Can anything be done? Option 1, reducing expenditures. The idea here is that if the government spends less money while bringing in the same amount, it will create a surplus for itself and can use this extra money to pay off the debt. Let's investigate this solution. In 2009, government expenditures totaled $3.5 trillion, while receipts only totaled $2.1 trillion. The Big Four. In 2009, government spending on Department of Defense alone was $636 billion. On Social Security, $706 billion. On Medicare and Medicaid, $651 billion. And on unemployment insurance, $93 billion. So these programs alone account for over $2 trillion in spending, over 99% of all government receipts for that fiscal year. So it is virtually impossible to eliminate the annual deficit without cutting spending on the Big Four, but doing so is politically unrealistic. Any politician who suggests cutting spending on the military is considered weak and soft on terror, and a politician who suggests cutting spending on Social Security, Medicare, or unemployment is accused of not caring about the old, the sick, or the poor. Historically speaking, spending on the Big Four almost never decreases in any significant way. And this is ignoring every other government expenditure, including things like the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, NASA, and many, many more. How about option 2, increase government receipts? The idea here is that if the government spends the same amount but brings in more money, it can again create a surplus and use the extra money to pay off the debt. But where would this extra money come from? How about an increase in taxes? In 2009, individual and corporate income taxes made up over 1/2 of all government income. Yet even if these taxes were doubled, there would have still been a 2009 deficit of $400 billion. And of course, any tax increase, let alone a doubling, risks further crippling the economy. Borrowing more money is another way to increase receipts for the government, but of course borrowing would only sink the government further into debt, the opposite of our desired effect. This plan is similar to borrowing from Visa to pay off MasterCard. It may work in the short term, but it is certainly not a long-term solution. Can we grow our way out? Many economists think we can grow our way out of the debt problem. They state that the U.S. economy will bounce out of the current recession and then grow so robustly that the government can cut the deficit and even begin to pay off the debt. But is this actually a feasible solution? Let's take a look at projected annual deficits for the next 11 years. According to the White House's own numbers, between the year 2010 and the year 2020, the smallest deficit in any single year will be over $700 billion in 2014. If these numbers hold accurate, the 2020 debt is projected to surpass $21 trillion. And it's worthy to note that the actual deficit of $1.4 trillion in 2009 was 350% of the budget's original projection of a mere $400 billion. So the above figures may be overly optimistic. GDP overview. The GDP, the gross domestic product, is aimed at measuring a nation's total economic output over the year. If you have a high GDP, you can afford a higher debt, so the debt to GDP ratio is often cited. Now, according to IMF projections, the US GDP will total 14.8 trillion in 2010 and 18.2 trillion in 2015, a growth rate of about 4%. If we allow for the same growth rate between 2015 and 2020, we get a US 2020 GDP of $22.2 trillion. Now, combining this figure with our previously calculated debt figure, we get a US debt to GDP ratio at over 95% in the year 2020. So rather than growing our way out, we're only making the problem worse. Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve, said, "We're not going to monetize the debt." Unfortunately, the only two options left are to monetize the debt or else to default. To default is to declare bankruptcy. If the US government stepped in to save the too big to fail banks from insolvency, it will surely do the same to save itself. What are some of the possible implications of monetizing the debt? There's inflation or even hyperinflation, loss of the US dollar's status as the reserve currency of the world, which in turn would decrease overall demand for it and thereby decrease its value further, a strict tightening of credit to the US government by foreign nations, and an inability of the US government to honor its obligations, including salaries of government employees, Social Security payments, unemployment payments, welfare payments, etc. Thank you for watching.